Hey everyone, tonight we're going to start our discussion of Section 7, but I wanted to start it out by an interesting chart that I saw in The Economist. Here is a look at historical GDP. Here you have China and here you have the US. The Economist was trying to make a point about how China has long been targeting the US to become the largest economy in the world. And the Economist using the following growth rate, inflation rates, and appreciation rates of currency, in this case the yuan against the dollar. Here's when the Economist predicts that China will take over the US as the world's largest economy. You may be saying, well, so what? Who cares? Well, in the context of Section 7, I would challenge you to think about what it means symbolically and psychologically to be the largest economy in the world. What has that meant for the US over the past 60 to 70 years, and what do you think it'll mean for China? Keep in mind, 2 centuries ago they were the largest economy in the world, and as per The Economist, somewhere between, I'd say, 2021 and 2024, they will be the largest economy in the world again. Okay, Section 7, Economic Growth and Productivity. Let's start out by a quick review of where we've been so far. Section 3, we talked about measuring economic performance. We were introduced the ideas of GDP, unemployment, and inflation. Section 4, we talked about national income and price determination, so the role that price played in GDP and unemployment and inflation. Section 5, we talked about the financial sector, money and banking. How does that system play into world economies? Then Section 6, we talked about in more depth, we talked about inflation, unemployment, and stabilization policies, particularly government stabilization policies, and sort of the pros and cons of government intervention to keep economies stable. Let's talk about where we're going to go in Section 7. Module 37, we're going to talk, that's tonight, long-run economic growth. 38, we'll talk about productivity and growth. 39, we're going to talk about why economic growth rates differ. And then we'll talk about economic growth and macroeconomic models, what that means. Keep in mind that after Module 39, we will have an assessment. That is this Friday, so the Friday before spring break. So what are we going to cover in Section 7 sort of thematically? We're going to talk facts about long-run growth. We'll then discuss the factors that economists believe determine the pace of long-run growth. We'll examine how government policies can help or hinder growth, and we'll consider questions about environmental sustainability of growth. So that's thematically what we're going to cover in Section 7 in each of those 4 modules above. Tonight, Module 37, long-run economic growth, 5 things. First, measuring long-run economic growth, how we do that. Second, how real GDP has changed over time. Third, how real GDP varies across countries. Fourth, sources of long-run economic growth. And fifth, how productivity is driven by really 3 things: physical capital, human capital, and technological progress. And I'm going to tell you, but before we jump into the depths of this, I think Module 37 could have been about 3 pages long. It was a little disappointing that it was longer, but I'm going to try to get through this in about 5 minutes. Okay, so the first 2 of the 5 things we're going to cover tonight: measuring long-run growth and how real GDP has changed over time. The first one, measuring long-run growth, economic growth, how do we do that? Well, it's just real GDP per capita. It's real GDP divided by the number of people in a country. How has real GDP changed over time? Well, you can see here in the graph out of the book, 3 countries being compared. United States, you can see the little blip here in World War II, and we're going to talk about that, why there was a little blip. But look at the United States. Thing for you to remember, very, very steady when it comes to changes in real GDP, so inflation-adjusted GDP over time. Look what's happened here in India. Relatively constant, even dipped a little bit, but now is starting to turn up significantly. We're going to talk about how productivity has changed India's growth rate. Look at China, much more dramatic in the way that it is growing and on a trajectory, as we saw, to overtake the US probably by 2021 or 2022. There is an equation in the module that you just need to remember. It's called the Rule of 70. Rule of 70 talks about the number of years for a variable to double, so in this case GDP, and the number of years it takes for GDP to double equals 70 divided by the annual growth rate of that variable. What they're trying to say in the book, and again I think they take way too many words to say it, is that GDP tends to grow slowly. When we talk about the size of an economy doubling, it doesn't usually happen overnight. China has been an exception over the past 10 years or so where we've seen double-digit changes in GDP. For the most part, countries tend to grow pretty slowly. Even China, which is dipping down into the 7.5%, 6% annual growth rate to double. And that's really all you need to know about it from that. Okay, the next thing that it talks about in this module is sources of long-run economic growth. Well, the first sentence in this section is pretty telling. Sustained growth in real GDP per capita occurs only when the amount of output produced by the average worker increases steadily. So what does that mean? Well, productivity equals output per worker, so output produced by the average worker. Output per worker or productivity is real GDP divided by the number of people working. So different than real GDP per capita, real GDP per number of people working is output per worker. We then talk about the factors that lead to higher productivity. What are they? Well, physical capital. Remember, physical capital is human-made goods used to produce other goods and services. Second is human capital, improvement in labor caused by education. And the third is technology, the technical means for the production of goods and services. The book uses the example of what they call the Walmart effect and why Walmart became so productive, mostly because of their use of technology and their ability to get so much more out of the incremental worker because of the use in technology, largely in forecasting and predicting inventory. So in this context, factors that lead to higher productivity, physical capital, human capital, and technology, I tried to go find some contemporary data that would help illustrate how these ideas of physical capital, human capital, and technology actually lead to higher productivity. The one I was able to find is one called gross fixed capital formation. Capital formation, think of it as investment in property, plant, and equipment, and investment in things like roads and bridges and train tracks, and call it infrastructure. If you think about changes in productivity driving increases in GDP, look at this. So gross fixed capital formation present annual growth. Look what happened in 2009 across the countries that were significantly impacted by the global financial crisis. Just got kicked in the butt. 10% or greater decrease in gross fixed capital formation, including the U.S. People weren't investing in property, plant, equipment, and nor was the government. Now look at this. Look at here, India and China. What happened during 2009? Well, India growing, China growing. Then things started to contract a little bit. But look what's going on here in these two countries. China continues to be a leader in gross fixed capital formation. An interesting correlation, an interesting relationship between that and their fast pace of not only GDP growth, but the timing on which we think they may take over the U.S., their largest economy in the world. So interesting data for us to consider as we move forward. That's it for tonight. Hope you have a great night, and I'll see you in class tomorrow.